Hi, this is David Unsworth, English editor of the PanAm Post. I'm here in Lancaster, New Hampshire at the Free State Project's 14th annual Pork Fest. Today we'll be talking with Lyn Ulbricht, the mother of Silk Road founder Ross Ulbricht, who was sentenced to double life sentences for hosting the dark web marketplace. His story was recently featured in the documentary Deep Web. His cases raised serious questions regarding prosecutorial overreach, sentencing guidelines, Fourth Amendment rights, and the intersection of law and technology. Lyn has led the campaign to free Ross. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, thanks for talking with me.
So, to begin with, when you, what we've seen in the media about Ross's motivation for starting this online marketplace, it was very much influenced by libertarian ideology, and particularly his interest in Austrian economists like Ludwig von Mises. He had been studying science at Penn State, and he became less interested with science and more interested in economics and philosophy and political theory. So can you tell us about the ideological foundations of the Silk Road,
That is accurate that Ross was motivated by philosophical thinking in wanting to share free market ideas. Actually, he wrote about it in his LinkedIn profile that he wanted to create an economic simulation. However, contrary to popular opinion, he told me he was not referring to Silk Road at all. He was talking about a video game which he created, and I remember this, and it was based on Austrian economics, like World of Warcraft or Second Life, that sort of thing, but it was a video game to introduce and allow people to kind of use in a virtual way those principles and then bring them into their own lives in countries where, this is somewhat of a foreign concept, and he saw it as a liberating thing, that this video game. And as the judge herself said at sentencing, it's clear you started Silk Road for philosophical reasons. But she said, well, I'm not sure you've given that philosophy up.
That would be Judge Forrest?
Forrest.
Yes.
And so she said, since you haven't given it up, this justifies her putting him away for life.
Enhanced sentencing.
Yes, exactly. So it's actually a First Amendment question in the sentencing. This was not, the appellate court doesn't agree. They kind of brushed it aside, but it is forbidden to use someone's political views in a sentencing by the First Amendment and Congress. And she did, but she enhanced it with it. But yes, Ross is a very, and there's the Silk Road. I've read the Silk Road Manifesto, and it's basically a libertarian manifesto.
The non-aggression principle, and with regard
voluntary interaction.
And with regard to drug use, the principle of harm reduction, which organizations like the Drug Policy Alliance have said, well, is it better to purchase drugs in an online marketplace or to purchase drugs from criminals in the street?
Right. That wasn't actually in the manifesto. Drugs aren't mentioned in any of Ross's writings or the Silk Road writings. Actually, I don't know who wrote that manifesto, but I assume that it's a libertarian manifesto, really, but that is a point about harm reduction, a separate point. But yes, as far as the reason that it existed, but to be clear, the administration of the site had rules against things that created victims that weren't voluntary.
Absolutely. Stolen credit card information, child pornography, weapons. Mm-hmm. There were rules that, again, were relatively in line with libertarian principles.
Exactly. That's correct.
And as you mentioned in your speech yesterday, one of the most serious issues here is Ross didn't directly hurt anyone, ever. He didn't.
Right. No,
and if you're going to, and all of these online marketplaces at various times, Amazon, Facebook, Craigslist, are we going to be prosecuting these people, Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and the founder of Craigslist? Tell us about the problems in the trial. Obviously, there's the issue of the severeness of the sentence. I mean, there are murderers and rapists and child molesters who have never seen the inside of a prison cell or have gotten sentences of a couple years.
Much lighter, yeah.
And there's also very serious issues with the federal agents investigating the case, the theft of millions of dollars worth of bitcoins. The government still cannot say how it gained access to the server, which I believe was found in Iceland, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, they made an explanation, but it was discredited internationally.
Sure.
Yeah. It was a lie, basically, is what that was called. And this was under oath by a federal agent, and it was called a lie by experts.
Tell us about the decision reached by the Second Court of Appeals in May of this year, if I'm not mistaken. By
The end of May, yeah.
Gerard Lynch.
Right. Well, we were very hopeful that at least they would let Ross have a resentencing before a different judge, because this sentence has come under a great deal of criticism. And there's a lot of over-sentencing in the United States now, and a spike in life sentences. It's quite alarming. It's quintupled since the drug war in the 80s. But they didn't. They upheld it, and they said, well, we might not have given this sentence, but it was within her discretion to do so, and we're going to uphold it. And then they used different rationale for justifying it. And I don't see any justification for it. Or of the other 17,000 nonviolent people who have life sentences in the United States, it's outrageous and shocking. And they said that Ross, because he believed that Silk Road could reduce harm, because he didn't think the laws were right about drugs, that meant he was a poor candidate for recidivism.
A danger to society, an enemy of the state, almost, if you will.
Would be likely to do it again, and in 20 years, because he'd have to serve 20 years under the mandatory minimums.
Now, am I correct was the idea of Ross taking a plea deal ever proposed?
It wasn't a real plea deal. It was, we will offer you 10 years up to life. It'll be up to the judge, and we were going to recommend that she give you life. That was the deal. And that if you take that deal, you're pretty much guaranteed life with no appeal. So it's not really a deal.
It makes going to trial a risk worth taking.
Exactly.
It virtually makes going to trial a risk worth taking.
Right. Even though it's a bad risk in the United States, and the trials are basically on their way out because it's so difficult to win a trial now.
One of the things you've discussed in relation to the case is the fabrication of evidence in the digital age. This is something that should be a concern for all civil libertarians. Tell us about the potential for fabrication of evidence in Ross's case.
Right. Almost all the evidence was digital and shown on a screen to the jury. And I've been told by expert after expert that it's very vulnerable to tampering, planting, editing. You do not know, and you cannot tell forensically if it's been tampered with. And actually, as I mentioned in the talk, proof of tampering has been discovered, but it's after trial. So we need a new trial to show that, as well as, and it's looking like it's another corrupt agent, and proof of another Dread Pirate Roberts, which was the pseudonym they said Ross was using, and that he was the only one who used it. Well, proof of a Dread Pirate Roberts logging in after Ross was in prison has been found. So he wasn't the only one. So this casts doubt on, and we don't know how many others, you can't tell, and this casts doubt on all of this evidence, plus the corrupt agents having run of the site, not only stealing, but they had the ability to act as Dread Pirate Roberts and other aliases and pretty much change and adapt and use anything on the site they wanted. They had that access.
Ross is being made an example because of his ideological beliefs.
I believe that is true.
There were other people who were culpable. Now, to what degree, that's up for debate, I suppose, but and many of the other people involved in the Silk Road received much lighter sentences, a couple of years or 5 years.
Yeah, the worst one was 10. The biggest drug dealer on Silk Road got 10 years.
Was that the Dutch?
Yeah, Jan Slom.
Yep.
They never said that Ross sold any drugs at all. They said that he ran a website where other people bought and sold things, including illegal drugs. And on that basis, like you said, well, Amazon has sold illegal drugs. Craigslist has sold illegal drugs. It's a very slippery slope, and it's of concern. It's setting a precedent here that is quite dangerous.
Now, a very serious issue that has emerged in this case that I'm sure you get asked about quite frequently is the 6 alleged murders for hire. But obviously, it begs the question, why were these introduced, but then he was never charged with any of them?
Right.
And could they have fabricated that as well?
Oh, yeah. I mean, they're only based on chats between, and they dropped all of them except one after they were able to deny him bail.
Is that case still pending in Maryland?
There is an indictment in Maryland. It's never been prosecuted. It's just sitting there for 3.5 years now.
And there's no
and
statute.
It's included
is there
in
a statute of limitations on that?
I keep trying to find that out. I don't, apparently not. And it doesn't require proof. That is where the corrupt agents operated.
And what's not in dispute, no one was ever murdered.
No one was ever murdered. Not at all.
Not in dispute at all.
No, not at all. Even though the media loves to call it murder. And I'm like, where's the murder? Or it's a murder mystery, and it's a murder. No, there were no murders.
And these clearly had a great influence on the case and on the subsequent sentencing.
Right, because they were allowed to talk about it at trial, even though they said, we're not charging him, but we can, and then they talked about it, and...
Which is extremely troubling.
And it's part of the appeal. Wait a minute, you're sentencing somebody based on something that he didn't have a chance to defend himself against. You never proved it. You never bothered to bring it to trial. Yet you brought fake IDs to trial. So what's the deal? And I asked a defense attorney, he says, well, it speaks volumes that they didn't charge him. Why not? Well, I believe it's because they can't prove it. They don't. Well, I mean, they don't. I mean, because he didn't do it. And maybe they know who set that up. I don't know. Something is weird about that they didn't charge him. It doesn't, and it's wrong because that means they can charge they can talk about anybody. They can say you arranged murders for hire and take you to court for a parking ticket, and then enhance that sentence to huge, really long, because
it's extremely troubling.
It's very upsetting.
Now, the incident that really put Silk Road in the crosshairs of federal investigators was when New York Senator Chuck Schumer got on the Senate floor and said,
courthouse
five-alarm fire here. There's the Silk Road out there. We need to stop this. We need to protect our children, and so on and so forth. What can civil libertarians do now to raise awareness about this case, and what are the implications of Ross's case for the rest of us?
Yeah,
and
just
what
to
can
mention,
we do against these people like Chuck Schumer and these big government types who have no regard for civil liberties?
Good question. And by the way, the lead prosecutor, Preet Bharara, recently fired by Trump, was Chuck Schumer's special counsel for years. And Judge Forrest was not recommended by Schumer for her position, and she was Ross's judge. So Schumer's all over this case. And what to do about Schumer? I don't know. I've been talking to people that say, look, we need to do something politically, maybe back somebody who'd be against him. Right now, I'm concentrating on the next steps in the courts. Yeah. It's just so much you can do, right? But politically...
he's so powerful. I mean, now, especially now that he's the minority leader, and Democrats have 48 votes in the Senate. He could be the Senate majority leader, depending on how the midterm elections go. Let's hope not.
Very powerful. Yeah, he's And, I don't know. I feel like I'm just one person, and we are just one family. And so... I think changing the narrative, pointing out the big picture as you are doing right now of what's really at stake here. It's not just about one man and one website, or it's not about drugs. It's about our protections and the tendency of the government to expand and intrude in our lives. I think we're at a tipping point in history, and it could go either way. I'm very concerned about it, and this case spotlights that. And they're using the drug war to do it, and they're using all kinds of things to do it. And this case is one of the ones that's going to set precedent that will allow them to expand that.
And it's just utterly astounding. Just in this region, for example, just making a comparison, that has been devastated in community after community by the pedophilia scandals in the Catholic Church. Most of those priests never saw the inside of a jail cell. A couple of years, 5 years. I mean, they harmed dozens, hundreds, thousands of people and thousands of lives, and they get a slap on the wrist. And for hosting a website, you get 2 life sentences with no possibility of parole. I mean, it's utterly astounding.
No, it's terrible. And one of the things I want to do is network with groups that are fighting that, bringing back parole. They took parole out of the federal system in the 80s in the drug war. And, of course, it feeds the prison industrial complex and all the money, because the longer you have it, I mean, it'll cost
and
millions.
private prisons, which are rapidly expanding.
Yep. It'll cost millions of dollars to keep Russ in there for life. And he's not a danger to anyone. If anything, he could contribute, to society. And he wouldn't harm a fly. And he's not going to go start another Silk Road. And, especially after 20 years, and he hasn't been on the Internet for 20 years. And they say, well, he should be an example because he's high profile. And I'm like, well, first of all, it hasn't worked. His sentence actually saw a boost in darknet sites, a boost. And they're way bigger.
Drug sales and marketplaces.
Yeah, on the dark web, right?
Sure.
It didn't stop anything. It actually seemed to have stimulated business. And yet they insist that it's a deterrent. And so he must pay the price to be the deterrent. That's wrong. He is an individual. He has rights, and they're taking those away, as far as I can see.
He's being made an example, and the issues with life sentences without the possibility of parole for non-violent crimes should terrify all of us, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or a Libertarian or whatever. I mean, it's
a death sentence. It's a slow death sentence, pure and simple. That's what it is.
I think that for violent crimes, that's one thing. But for non-violent crimes, and it's not just the criminal justice issue, like you just mentioned, it's the economic issue. The cost of, we have the military-industrial complex, now we have the prison-industrial complex, and for a nation based on principles of freedom and liberty, we incarcerate more people than anywhere in the world.
That is correct.
We have 1% of our population behind bars now.
It's a national disgrace.
And the statistic I often hear is that half of those are for nonviolent drug offenses. Half.
More than half. More than 60% now.
Oh, it's
awful. And of course the children and the families. There's such a ripple effect, and then those children are more likely to go into prison. So it feeds this monster that's devouring lives, and doesn't stop. The thing is, I'm not for drugs, but it doesn't stop anybody from using drugs. It's a huge failure in that regard. But it's a big success if you want to expand government and make a lot of money.
Governments are incapable of stopping people from using drugs.
Right. That's been proven already with alcohol prohibition.
They can't. We should decriminalize all of them and treat it as a public health issue, not as a criminal justice issue. The last thing I'd just like to ask you about, obviously one of the things that you're always looking for in the appeals process is friend of the court briefs and so forth. Yeah. Could you give us a rundown of who you've been working with or what organizations you've reached out to or have reached out to you regarding this case?
Well, we're just starting that process for the next steps.
And also, what, in conjunction with that question, am I correct in thinking that the only hope for Ross now is an appeal to the Supreme Court?
We are petitioning the Second Circuit. That is the next step in the process.
Okay.
But I've been told they're very, very rarely rehear cases. So I honestly not pinning much hope on that. And then after that, it would be the Supreme Court. There could be some very important Supreme Court issues here. I'm hoping they would take it. And to help them take it, if other organizations say, yeah, this is important and you should hear it, it will help. For our last appeal, Electronic Frontier Foundation joined it, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, a former federal judge, Nancy Gertner, said the sentence based on uncharged crimes is absolutely wrong. Drug Policy Alliance, who you mentioned, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, Just Leadership USA, all joined it.
What about, say, the ACLU or?
They did not do it. I think there's a chance, possibly at a higher level, they will. Maybe, I hope so. I guess it depends on what arguments are made.
Have you been in touch in any way, shape, or form with, say, Ron and Rand Paul about this case?
I talked to Rand Paul at Freedom Fest last year briefly, and he, it was just a conversation, and otherwise, I said, your father, because Ross joined the Ron Paul campaign.
Sure.
That was a big part of Ross's,
thinking.
Yes, exactly, and his passion. And I said, your father helps, inspire my son. Hello. And he was, nice, but he didn't really, I think he has other fish to fry at the moment.
Right.
So.
Rand Paul is trying to position himself. I mean, There's even discussion that he might try to take on Trump in the primary here.
Oh, really?
He clearly has presidential aspirations.
Yeah.
But well, Lyn, thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for being with us. We really appreciate it.
I